Colin Brooks walked into the Furnace Creek Visitor Center just after 8:00 a.m. on July 7, 2014. The temperature was already 98 degrees Celsius and climbing fast. He wore sun-faded cargo pants, a sweat-darkened boonie hat, and a hydration pack slung tight across his back. Security footage showed him calm, maybe even cheerful. A ranger behind the desk handed him the standard backcountry paperwork. Colin didn't hesitate. He filled it out neatly, listing solo hike, 7 days, entering via Warm Spring Canyon, exiting via Goler Wash. Then added a note, just need the quiet. The ranger on duty was used to confident hikers, but something about Colin made her pause. He wasn't reckless, his gear was solid, his route technically possible, but something about the way he smiled when he said, "I've done worse," lingered. She mentioned the forecast, asked if he'd heard it. Colin nodded. "That's the point," he said. His permit was filed at 8:26 a.m. It was supposed to be routine, a week-long loop through remote desert country, challenging but not impossible for someone with his background. Colin had served 2 tours in Iraq, did wilderness survival training in Colorado, and once backpacked solo across the Mojave. On paper, he knew what he was doing. He left the visitor center without fanfare, one more determined figure stepping into the vast silence of Death Valley. Outside, a white Tacoma pickup with Nevada plates idled in the parking lot. He threw his gear in the back, pulled out a paper map, checked it against a marked trail notebook, then drove off. A camera caught him turning south, toward Warm Spring Road. That was the last confirmed sighting of Colin Brooks. 3 days later, a ranger doing routine permit audits noticed his name still on the backcountry log, but no checkout record. Normally, that wouldn't be cause for alarm. Hikers often forget. But when a courtesy call to his listed emergency contact, Rachel Brooks, went unanswered, it set something in motion. A truck, a name, a date, and the sense that something had gone wrong. No one panicked. Not yet. People disappear in Death Valley every year, but they also reappear just as quickly, sunburned, dehydrated, a little embarrassed. But by day 7, when there was still no sign of Colin or his truck, that changed. By July 10th, the temperatures had hit 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Rangers at Furnace Creek were instructed to post warning signs in 5 languages. Tourists from Europe were collapsing in parking lots. A park medic treated 3 cases of heat stroke before noon, and still people went in. Colin's route, traced with a highlighter across a topographic map, wasn't insane, just ambitious. Warm Spring Canyon was bone dry by midsummer, its old mining roads barely distinguishable from the dust. Mingle Pass, even in spring, was borderline impassable without a high-clearance Forks 4. But the biggest red flag wasn't the terrain, it was the heat. July is when the desert stops forgiving mistakes, when a wrong turn becomes a death sentence. Rangers knew this, and yet, when Colin signed that permit, no one stopped him, not legally, not officially. He had food, water, shelter, experience. On paper he was ready, but paper doesn't mean much in 120-degree sun. In the days following his disappearance, park officials tried to retrace what they missed. His vehicle had been found 2 miles off-road, parked beside a collapsed trailhead marker. The Tacoma's tires were half deflated, its bed covered in a fine coat of dust. No signs of a struggle, no note. Inside, rangers found a few empty water bottles, a torn map, and a small weathered Bible. A page was dog-eared in Matthew, another bookmarked in Psalms. One ranger, a veteran named Dwyer, remembered Colin from earlier that summer. Said he'd seen him camped along the West Rim in May, reading by headlamp and eating cold beans out of the can. "Quiet guy," Dwyer said, "but something heavy on him, like he was walking off something he couldn't name." The park reopened his file as a missing person under extreme conditions. Rescue teams were notified, though quietly. Death Valley had already seen 2 fatalities that summer, and headlines didn't help anyone. A helicopter was requested. It circled the area twice before fuel forced it back to base. Nothing, no movement, just silence and heat waves. On the fourth day they found bootprint single file, turning off the trail, vanishing into gravel. Whatever Colin was chasing, it had led him into the hottest, deadliest part of the park. And now, the question wasn't whether he'd return. It was whether he ever meant to. Colin Brooks had sketched the whole thing by hand. A spiral bound right in the rain notebook, its cover sun-bleached and weather-creased, was found later in his glove compartment. The pages were filled with not just maps but layered thoughts, elevation notes, alternate paths, emergency waypoints. He wasn't improvising, he had a plan. The route was ambitious, brutal, even but not insane. He'd start in Warm Spring Canyon, head west through Butte Valley, over Mengle Pass, and descend into Goler Wash. From there, the idea was to loop around toward Ballarat and cross back through the Panamint Range to exit near Emigrant Campground. 71 miles, give or take. Most of it unmaintained, some of it nearly erased. Goler Wash was a notorious stretch, steep, narrow, unpredictable. Mengle Pass, known for crushing axles and destroying the knees of anyone unlucky enough to hike it, was barely marked even in ranger briefings. The area between Anvil Canyon and Butte Valley is filled with dead Rhodes mining trails from the early 1900s, faded tracks that lead to nowhere. He wasn't the first to attempt something like this, but most tried it in spring or fall, when the sun wasn't angry enough to burn through canvas. Colin had chosen July, Death Valley's cruelest month, and the ranger notes reflected that concern. Experienced, marine, solo, route clear, but terrain hazardous, watch temps. He left no GPS ping, no spot device, just a paper trail and confidence built on years of surviving worse. But that confidence can be a kind of blindness. His route depended on water caches working, on trails still existing, on no injuries. It didn't leave a lot of margin for error. In the notebook, just before a hand-drawn map of Mengle Pass, he'd written, "Test everything, especially yourself." It wasn't a vacation. This was something else, something personal, and it showed in how he chose the route, not the easiest, but the loneliest. Places few go, even fewer return from. He'd marked a small X near a dry spring with the words, "Rest here, think." 7 years later, when rangers would try to retrace his steps, they'd find it nearly impossible to follow. Winds had erased prints, flash floods had taken parts of the canyon walls. But the question wasn't where he went. It was what he was hoping to find. Before he was a headline, before he became a name carved into a cold case board, Colin Brooks was the guy who always brought his own knife to potlucks. That's what his friend Jake used to joke. He trusted no one's gear but his own. But it wasn't paranoia, it was how he survived. Colin served 2 tours as a Marine recon scout. Iraq, Kandahar, places that leave their mark whether you want them to or not. He came home in 2010 and never quite re-entered the world. He lived in Reno for a while, taught weekend wilderness survival workshops, worked odd jobs fixing satellite dishes and HVAC units. His marriage to a nurse named Morgan lasted 3 years. They tried. He tried. But there were things he couldn't explain, and silences she couldn't live with. After the divorce, he moved into a converted shipping container outside of Beatty, no running water. Solar panels barely working. He didn't call it off-grid, called it uncluttered. A kind of self-imposed exile. His sister Rachel, who was listed on his backcountry permit, said it best: he didn't want to be found, not completely. He wasn't aimless. He read philosophy, studied old mining maps, subscribed to obscure geology magazines. At the bar, when he actually showed up, he'd nurse 1 beer for hours, drawing in a little leather sketchbook. He wasn't antisocial, just somewhere else. Always somewhere else. Rachel said Death Valley had been on his list for years, not for the challenge, not for the heat, but because it was quiet. He said it was the last place in the U.S. where you could hear your own breath for miles. His friends knew about the PTSD. He didn't hide it, but he didn't explain it either. Therapy wasn't his thing. Fixing gear, sharpening knives, testing limits, that was how he made peace with whatever ghosts followed him out of the desert overseas. In the last voicemail he left for Rachel, 2 days before he vanished, he said, "Don't worry, sis, I'm not going anywhere. Just need to walk a bit further than usual." He chuckled. Then nothing. Some people disappear by accident. Others fade because they want to. But Colin didn't vanish out of fear. He vanished looking for something he couldn't quite name. On July 14th, the logbook at Furnace Creek still had Colin Brooks listed as active. Technically, his permit expired that morning. Rangers give solo hikers a 24-hour grace period, assuming a flat tire or extra rest day. By July 15th, when his name hadn't been scratched off, someone made a call. Rachel Brooks didn't answer the first time. She picked up on the second. Her voice was calm, concerned, not alarmed. "He probably just forgot," she said. "Or lost track of time. Colin's like that." The ranger didn't disagree, but the paperwork had to be followed. A note was logged: "Missing overdue, permit, 18,947. By the next morning, they dispatched a patrol unit. It wasn't a search party, not yet. Just a ranger in a beat-up truck driving out along Warm Spring Road, scanning trailheads for signs of a parked vehicle. It didn't take long. Colin's white Tacoma was found under a scraggly mesquite tree, pulled a few feet off the trail. All 4 tires intact. No signs of damage. Dust coated the windshield in a smooth, undisturbed layer. Inside the cab, a half-empty jug of water, a trail guide wedged between the seats, and a set of keys still hanging from the ignition. No footprints around the vehicle, no note, just the buzz of distant heat and the steady silence of the desert. The ranger took a few steps out into the flat, called his name. Nothing but the wind and the sound of his own boots on gravel. Back at the station, the paperwork changed. It was no longer overdue. It became missing with confirmed vehicle. And that changed everything. Search and rescue teams were placed on alert. A grid was drawn over Colin's proposed route. Helicopter availability was requested from Barstow. The temperature that day was 119 F. There was no cloud cover. No rain in the last 14 days. Colin Brooks had vanished somewhere in a wilderness that chewed up even the careful. He knew what he was doing, and still he was gone. What rattled the rangers most wasn't just that his truck was untouched. It was how quiet the site felt, like whatever had happened to him hadn't left a single mark behind. Day 1 was reconnaissance. 2 rangers on ATVs pushed west down Warm Spring Road, fanning out near Willow Canyon and the old talc mine. They called his name, marked waterholes, left trail tape. The helicopter came in low around midday, its rotors breaking the oppressive silence, chopping through 120-degree air, but nothing stood out. No signal fires, no flashing mirrors, no movement. Day 2 they went higher. Mangle Pass, Striped Butte, the ghost settlement near the geologist's cabin. They scanned for anything out of place: disturbed gravel, dropped gear, the glint of sun off metal. At 2:14 p.m., a park volunteer on aerial lookout radioed in, "TARP, Southwest Quadrant, Grid Box 7H, possible shelter." The chopper circled. A tan canvas square, weighed down with rocks at the corners, visible from 600 feet. Hopes jumped. Maybe he was holed up, waiting for rescue. They landed a mile out and hiked in, gear ready, adrenaline sharp. But the tarp wasn't his. It was old, faded, ripped in 2 places. Underneath, just cracked soil, a rusted canteen, and an empty food wrapper from a brand that hadn't existed since 2003. It belonged to someone else. Another story, another ghost. The search didn't stop. By day 3, they brought in canine units. The dogs caught nothing. The wind made scent useless. Heat rippled up off the rocks like invisible fire. One ranger suffered heat exhaustion and had to be medevaced out. They lost radio contact twice. Batteries were draining faster than expected. On day 4, they found a trail, or thought they did. A faint boot print, half pressed into a wash, size 11. But it was impossible to know when it had been left. It could have been Colin's. It could have been 10 years old. The area they were searching was roughly 56 square miles of jagged terrain. No shade, no water, just stone and heat and silence. They called his name again and again. But the desert didn't echo back. By the end of day 4, one thing became clear. If Colin Brooks was out there, he wasn't trying to be found, or he no longer could be. It was early morning on the 5th day when a ranger named Keller, hiking south of Willow Spring, spotted something half hidden under a granite overhang. At first, he thought it was just trash, maybe debris washed out from an old mining site. But as he got closer, he froze. A titanium camp stove, a battered black canteen, a rolled-up sleeping pad faded from sun. Each item laid out with almost deliberate care, not scattered as if lost, but placed. Tucked into a narrow shadow beneath the rock, like someone had made camp, then vanished. Keller radioed the coordinates back to base. 2 other rangers were dispatched to assist. Together, they swept a 300-yard radius. No footprints, no drag marks, no signs of an animal. The gear showed no Damagino claw marks, no burns, no broken zippers. It hadn't been ransacked, it had been left. A scrap of canvas nearby was confirmed to match the tarp Colin had been seen packing on camera at Furnace Creek, but there was nothing else. No journal, no phone, no bag, not even food wrappers. One ranger suggested maybe he'd gone off to scout something, maybe he'd fallen. They checked the nearby gullies and dry ravines. Drones were flown overhead. Again, nothing. The temperature had reached 124 degrees F that day. The rocks were too hot to sit on. The air tasted metallic. The desert didn't offer clues, it absorbed them. The items were catalogued and bagged, one by one, quietly. No blood, no broken bones, just a campsite without a camper. When Rachel Brooks was told about the discovery, she asked one question. Was his knife there? It wasn't. Neither was the small Bible, or the watch he always wore. It didn't make sense. If he'd been injured, why not use the tarp for a signal? If he'd been dehydrated, why walk away from shelter? The outcrop faced south, looking toward a stretch of empty desert and the blurred outline of distant hills. Some believed he continued on foot. Others thought he never left that site at all. But the gear told only one story. Someone had been there. And then, suddenly, they weren't. The desert held its silence. And so did the case. By day 12, the rescue effort shifted. Fewer boots on the ground, fewer hours in the air. The official terminology changed again from search and rescue to recovery. No one said it out loud, but they all felt it. The mission was no longer to bring Colin Brooks home alive. It was to bring something home. Anything. Rachel didn't accept it. She stayed in the valley, sleeping in a rented camper near Stovepipe Wells, organizing civilians and off-duty rangers who volunteered to help. She posted flyers in gas stations on park bulletin boards. Missing hiker, reward offered, answers needed. She printed maps with Colin's known route, circled the outcrop where his gear had been found, and handed them to anyone who asked questions, or didn't. She retraced the path herself alone twice, once at sunrise, once at dusk. Her boots blistered, her lips cracked. But she didn't stop looking. Back in Reno, their father tried to contact media outlets. Most declined. One local news station ran a 60-second segment buried between wildfire updates and weather. It showed a photo of Colin in uniform and asked viewers to contact park rangers with any information. The phones didn't ring. By the end of the second week, the official search had cost over $83,000, fuel, overtime, equipment, and still nothing. A memo circulated. Low probability of recovery. Recommend suspension unless further evidence surfaces. On July 28th, the operation was formally paused. Not closed. Just paused. Rachel received the call in the middle of organizing a second wave of volunteers. She didn't say anything when the ranger gave her the update, just listened, then hung up. Then stared into the horizon like she was waiting for the silence to break. Some families hold funerals with empty coffins. Some declare death after 7 years. But Rachel wouldn't. Not yet. She left a voice message on Colin's old number every Sunday, even though she knew it went nowhere. Just a habit, a ritual. "I'm still looking," she'd say. "Just so you know." And out in the emptiness, where cell towers don't reach and no footprints stay long, maybe he heard her. Or maybe he was never meant to be found. By fall, the official search was over, the paperwork filed, the grid maps archived, but stories still moved on the wind, soft as breath and hard to ignore. Local hikers, those who knew the back trails and dry riverbeds better than most, started whispering. They said a man had been seen out near Striped Butte, standing on a high ridge in the early morning light. Alone, motionless, watching. One said she raised a hand to wave, but he turned before she could. Just disappeared behind the rocks. No footprints, no camp nearby. Another claimed they heard someone walking behind them on the trail to Warm Spring, boots crunching in rhythm. But when they turned, there was no one there. Only sun, wind, and dust. They called him the Ghost in the Sand, not as a joke, but as a warning. Park rangers dismissed the claims, said heat plays tricks on the eyes. Mirage, suggestion, imagination. The desert is vast, and memory bends out there like the light, but the stories didn't stop. At a roadside diner in Tecopa, an off-duty ranger overheard a group of ATV riders talking about the guy with the green canteen, spotted a few miles past Mengle Pass. Said he was walking in the wrong direction southwest, away from everything, they shouted. He didn't answer. Just kept walking until the trail dipped and swallowed him whole. Someone found boot prints in a washbed a year later, too deep to be recent, but still there, as if time had refused to erase them completely. They led nowhere, just ended. The thing about Death Valley is that it doesn't just take. It echoes, leaves questions pressed into the sand like handprints. Colin Brooks became one of those questions, a presence stitched into the heat waves. Always on the edge of the next ridge. Always one step out of reach. Rachel heard the stories too. People messaged her. Left voicemails, photos of blurs, GPS pins. She never dismissed them, not once. If he's out there, she'd say, he's waiting for someone to see him. Maybe he wanted to be found. Or maybe some part of him had already become part of the land itself, half man, half shadow, watching the trails he used to walk, and the people still foolish enough to follow. The official declaration came quietly. On the anniversary of his disappearance, July 14, 2015, Colin Brooks was marked as presumed deceased by exposure. No press conference, no interviews. Just a line added to a file and a folded flag mailed back to his sister. His service record meant someone thought it appropriate. Rachel didn't argue. In the eyes of the park and the state, the case was closed. There had been no body, no crime, no trail leading further than the outcrop. Everything else, boots, Bible, knife, were officially listed as unrecovered. The desert had taken one more. The headlines had moved on long before that. Wildfires, elections, another missing tourist who wandered too far from Badwater Basin. Colin's name no longer appeared in park updates or backcountry warnings. To most, he was a cautionary tale, a footnote, but not to those who'd known him. Jake, his closest friend from the Marines, started leaving a cold beer out on his porch every July, unopened. Just in case, he told no one in particular. Morgan, his ex-wife, never remarried. She kept a photo of him on her fridge door, Colin in sunglasses, halfway through a laugh. He could never fake that kind of happy, she once said. When it showed up, you held on to it. Rachel never stopped hiking. She returned to Death Valley every spring, alone, retracing the original loop with a GPS and a pack full of hope. At night, she'd lie on her back under a blanket of stars so sharp they hurt to look at. Sometimes she'd talk to him, just in case. "Still listening?" she'd whisper. "Still out here somewhere?" People think the desert is empty. It's not. It's layered. Every rock, every shadow holds a story. And Colin's became one of those. Not loud, not certain, but persistent. The desert doesn't leave markers. It doesn't grant closure. It takes what it takes and offers only silence in return. But every now and then, someone sees movement in the distance. A man walking where no trail exists, a shadow on the ridge at dusk, and for a moment they wonder, Maybe the desert didn't take him. Maybe it kept him. It was early March, 7 years to the month since the case had gone quiet. A group of rangers and volunteers were clearing debris from a dried-out riverbed near the southern edge of Anvil Canyon, part of a trail conservation effort to reopen blocked routes ahead of spring traffic. Most of what they pulled from the flood-battered gravel were sun-bleached branches, soda cans, and the occasional scrap of weather-warped nylon. Then someone called out. Wedged between two boulders, half buried under sediment and rust-colored shale, was a military-style ammo can, olive drab, hinged lid, standard issue. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. At first, they thought it was leftover trash from an old camper, or maybe part of a cache left behind during Desert Storm training years back. But when one of the rangers pried it open, the weight of the desert shifted again. Inside, a Ziploc bag of photographs, some warped and sun-bleached but still intact. A folded topographic map with inked notations along Warm Spring Road. A battered spiral notebook wrapped in plastic. And beneath it all, a laminated index card. The handwriting on the card was shaky but legible. If you found this, it means I didn't make it back. Don't go to the ranger. Don't alert the press. Follow the map. The photos were grainy and taken with an old disposable camera. Most were landscapes, desert flats, rock formations, one shadowed image of what looked like a narrow crevice in a canyon wall. But it was the final photo that made one of the rangers sit down in the sand and just stare. It was a selfie, sunburned, bearded, and unmistakably Colin Brooks. The box was sealed again and airlifted back to Furnace Creek that evening under lock and chain. Word spread fast, quietly but fast. Rangers who hadn't spoken his name in years said it in whispers. Not as legend, now, but as proof. Something had been left behind, intentionally. The desert doesn't give back often, but sometimes, just sometimes it does. And this time, it came with coordinates. The notebook inside the ammo can was water-stained, pages curled at the edges, ink bleeding where sweat or rain had warped the lines, but most of it was still readable. Each entry dated. The handwriting tight, deliberate, measured like someone who didn't want to waste space or time. The earliest pages chronicled weather patterns, elevation readings, water rations, observations about the terrain. Ridge collapses west of Old Mining Road. Avoid it. Coyote prints around tarp last night. Still alone. Stars unusually bright on day 4. Cold, still manageable. Then it changed. The middle entries grew more personal. Reflections on silence, on guilt, on memory. The desert doesn't judge, one line read, but it also doesn't forget. It was the final page that stopped the room. July 14, 2014. I think I found it. The trail doesn't match the maps anymore, but I marked it best I could. I'm light on water, light on food. If this ends here, let it mean something. If anyone finds this, I need you to finish what I started. There was no explanation, no what to finish, no mention of who he might be addressing, but the sentence carried weight. It felt rehearsed. Like Colin had written it in his head long before his pen ever touched the page. The entry was signed with his initials, CB. And underneath, almost like an afterthought, one last line scrawled hastily in the margin. It's not just me out here. That sentence changed everything. The search had ended 7 years ago because there was nothing left to search for. But now, the box suggested otherwise. He had lived long enough to write that, long enough to stash the can, long enough to believe someone might come looking someday. The rangers brought in a linguist to verify the handwriting. It matched previous samples. The photos were developed, the coordinates plotted, and quietly, behind locked doors, a new plan was drawn up. They weren't calling it a recovery anymore. They were calling it a trail. And it started with a sentence that felt more like a challenge than a goodbye. Finish what I started. HEMAP was old. National Geological Survey issue, circa 1997, creased and yellowed, with folds that had nearly worn through. Colin had circled a point in red ink, then drawn an arrow pointing south. The numbers beneath it weren't GP sheet used UTM, old-school military grid referencing. Whoever followed it would need to know how to read terrain the way Colin did, by line, by slope, by instinct. When plotted on a current satellite overlay, the coordinates landed in a section of Death Valley with no trails, no roads, and no official name. Just jagged relief lines, sun-scorched rock, and sheer isolation, 9 miles due south of where his truck had been found. In a straight line it didn't look far, but maps lie. The terrain in that quadrant was notorious. Vertical shale shelves, soft gravel ridges that collapsed underfoot, slot canyons that looked navigable from above but ended in 60-foot drops. It was country meant to keep people out, not guide them in. There were no springs, no shade, no cell service. A place designed for silence. Rangers cross-referenced the area with old mining records. One shaft, possibly exploratory, was drilled in the 1950s and quickly abandoned. No other documented activity. A geologist who'd surveyed the region in the early 2000s described it as fractured volcanic rubble, unstable and unforgiving. Still, the arrow pointed there. A 3-person recon team was quietly assembled. No press releases, no public search notices. The ammo can was never mentioned outside internal memos. This wasn't a recovery. It was something else, now part investigation, part pilgrimage. Like they weren't just looking for a man, but the reason he walked away in the first place. The coordinates were loaded into a secure GPS unit. Backup radios tested. Flight plans filed. If they could reach the site by foot, they'd mark it and photograph it. Nothing more. No assumptions. Just facts. But as one ranger muttered while strapping gear into a pack, nobody draws a map to nowhere. And Colin Brooks hadn't just vanished. He'd left a trail buried, encoded, and aimed straight at the heart of a place no one was supposed to go. There were 14 photos inside the Ziploc bag. Most had curled at the edges from heat and time, but they were intact. The ink dates on the backs matched the last week of Colin's recorded permit. July 2014. The first 6 were landscapes. Flat horizon shots taken at dusk or dawn, the sun low, shadows long. Each photo captured a different section of terrain ridge lines, rock formations, dry basins. To anyone else, they'd be unremarkable. But Colin had labeled them, tiny ballpoint notes in the margins. Day 3 S-turn wash. Broken crest 15, 0. Spire east-facing. It wasn't photography, it was documentation. He was mapping his route in pictures. 2 were selfies. In both, he's gaunt, sweating, dust-streaked, eyes sunburn red but sharp. He holds the camera low. The first is dated July 10. The second, July 13, just 1 day before the final journal entry. In that second image, behind him, the terrain shifts. A black outcrop juts from the canyon wall. And something else. The final 3 photos were the most disturbing. The 12th was taken at an angle, half-cropped, as if hurried. It shows a steep rock face with what appears to be a rectangular shadow at the base 2 uniform to be natural. The 13th zooms in. It's blurry, but you can make out what looks like a horizontal crack, about 5 feet wide. Not a cave, not erosion. An entrance. The 14th and final photo is dark, almost black, just a faint reflection off something metallic-crusted, curved, possibly a barrel or storage drum, and 2 vertical lines scrawled on the wall behind it. Symbols, or scratch marks. There's no context, no caption, just the timestamp, 7/14/14/4, 12 a.m. Why was Colin in a canyon before sunrise? Why did he photograph the same spot more than once? Or what was he trying to document? Some rangers suggested it was nothing, just a mine shaft, a rock fissure, tricks of light. Others weren't so sure. Because Colin hadn't sent these images to anyone. He didn't post them. He buried them. Carefully, purposefully. And that meant he wanted someone someday to see what he'd seen. Even if it meant going to the one place he never came back from. The journal changed everything. It was one thing to lose a man in the desert, happens more than anyone wants to admit. But it's something else to find his words deliberate. Urgent 7 years later. Rangers who'd filed Collins' case away with a sigh and a shrug now pulled his file back into the light. Internally, the discussion was fast and quiet. Publicly, it never happened. There were meetings behind closed doors at Furnace Creek. Old team leaders brought back in. Desert navigation specialists consulted. A new incident report was drafted not as a continuation of the 2014 disappearance, but as a separate file entirely. Code: Field Operation Echo. 7. Classification: Exploratory Recon. Objective: Unknown. Only a handful of people had access to the journal and the photos. Even fewer had clearance for the coordinates. The ammo can, now sealed in an evidence locker, was referenced only as Artifact 1. They didn't want attention. Not from the press, not from conspiracy theorists, not from families who would ask why no one had looked sooner. This wasn't about closure anymore. It was about confirmation. Collins' sister was contacted, but only vaguely. "We've reopened his file," they said. "New developments. We'll update you if there's anything substantial." Rachel asked for copies of the journal entries. They denied the request. Operational sensitivity. 2 Rangers were chosen for the task, not search and rescue regulars. These were specialist former military, high clearance, desert hardened. They moved fast, traveled light, and didn't ask unnecessary questions. Their orders were simple: verify the site, photograph, map, extract nothing. If something was found, a second team would follow. No press releases, no public filings. If they came back with nothing, the world wouldn't even know the desert had whispered again. But before they left, one of them, Garza, stood looking at the map and muttered under his breath, "He really walked this far?" No one answered, because that was the thing about Colin Brooks. Even in death, he didn't wait for permission. It took 2 days to reach the site. The Rangers hiked by headlamp through the night, resting only when the heat made movement impossible. The land fought them. Every step crumbled beneath their boots, mocked their compasses. Colin's red circle on the map had looked arbitrary back in the office. Out here, it felt like a bullseye. On the second afternoon, they found it. Tucked behind a rockfall that looked like nothing more than wind erosion, half concealed beneath a curtain of dead brush, was an opening, just wide enough for a grown man to pass through sideways. Too low for shelter, too clean to be random. Garza approached first. The entrance wasn't natural. The lines were too sharp, notched edges, worn in places like hands had gripped the stone over and over. A pocket of air rolled out, stale, dry, but cooler than the outside. He unholstered his sidearm, shined a flashlight in. The beam hit a wall 8 feet back, then another narrow passage veering left. "We go in," he said. The other ranger nodded. Inside, the light danced across soot-stained rock. Scorch marks. Someone had made fire here. Small ones, controlled. The floor was uneven, packed dust over stone. Near the bend, a faded footprint. Partial. Could have been years old. Could have been yesterday. No way to tell. Further in, they found a pocket chamber, maybe 12 feet wide. At the center, a collapsed tripod of metal rods and wire, scattered ash, charred fabric, a single rusted can. Garza crouched beside it and picked up what looked like a broken lens from an old headlamp. Then he saw it. Carved into the wall, 4 lines of hash marks. Vertical, neat, spaced, a tally. They counted 42. Beside it, scratched so faintly, it barely showed in the light. Still here. No body, no bag, no bones. Just a space that felt held, used, occupied. Garza stepped back and took a photo. "Confirm it," the second ranger said quietly. "Confirmed," Garza replied. Back outside, they stood in the heat and looked at the rocks, the sky, the silence that had swallowed a man whole. Colin hadn't disappeared. He had gone somewhere very specific, and now they knew where. But not why. Not yet. They dropped a weighted rope down the shaft, 40 feet of sheer black. The air changed halfway, cooled and still, with the faint metallic bite of long undisturbed space. Garza went first, boots scraping rock, flashlight gripped in his teeth. The other ranger, Hale, followed in silence. Below them, the light caught nothing but dust particles, suspended like ash in a beam of cathedral sun. At the bottom, silence. The chamber opened into a slanted basin, roughly 10 feet across, with a jagged ceiling and soot-stained walls. The smell hit first not rot, but dry decay. The kind that lingers in air long after whatever caused it is gone. Garza moved left. His light skimmed over the remnants of a fire pit-blackened rocks ringed around a bed of ash. Cracked bone fragments littered the edge. Small, scorched, animal, nothing human. Scattered like someone had eaten, or tried to. Nearby lay a rusted tin pot, and beside it, something more modern. A handheld radio, cracked down the side, antenna snapped in two. He lifted it gently, turning it over. The battery panel was missing. Insides corroded, but on the back, faintly scratched with a knife tip. July 12, 2 days before the last journal entry. Hale called out from the far wall, another pit. This one was deeper, narrower, empty. They logged it anyway. The floor of the cave was uneven, collapsed in places. No obvious footprints, just dust patterns, vague smears, as if someone had been here long enough for the earth to forget his exact steps. Garza swept his light toward the far wall. That's when they saw the tunnel. It sloped downward again, narrower, tighter. Man-made or natural, they couldn't tell. But the edges had been touched, smoothed, worn. They exchanged a look. No words. Then, slowly, they moved deeper underground. The tunnel curved hard left, then down again. The walls were closer here, the silence denser. Every breath sounded like an intrusion. Every footfall kicked up dust from somewhere it shouldn't have reached. Then the tunnel widened. The chamber beyond wasn't large, maybe 8 feet by 6, but it had been lived in, carefully, deliberately. The beam of Garza's flashlight swept across a patch of flattened ground where a green tarp had been laid out corner to corner, frayed at the edges, but unmistakably the same one Colin Brooks had packed in 2014. On top of it, a camp stove, long cooled and partially rusted. A cup beside it, filled with pebbles. 3 empty protein bar wrappers stacked neatly to the side. No chaos, no panic, just order. And in the far corner, a spiral. Stones, each the size of a fist, placed in a perfect coil. Not tossed, not accidental. Laid with care, a ritual, a pattern. At the center of the spiral, a pair of boots. Laces tucked in, toes pointed outward. No footprints leading to them, no footprints leaving, just boots, waiting. Hale didn't move for a moment. Garza crouched and ran his gloved fingers along the spiral, then stopped when he saw the edge of something buried beneath one of the outer rocks, a photograph, water-stained and warped. He pulled it gently free. It was one of the same photos from the ammo can, the one of the cave entrance. On the back, another scrawl. This is the place. They didn't speak. It felt wrong, too. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a message. Or maybe a grave. No body, no blood, just a presence. The kind that lingers. The kind that builds spirals for company and lays boots down like offerings. Back at the surface, heat shimmered off the rocks, but underground, time had stopped. Or maybe it had looped. Like something had begun down there and never finished. And what haunted them most wasn't what they found. It was what they didn't. They bagged what they could, the boots, the wrappers, the broken radio, soil samples from beneath the tarp. A swab of what looked like dried blood on the green nylon, just a smear near the corner, half hidden by dust. The photo, folded and refolded, was sealed in a separate sleeve. Everything was tagged, logged, lifted by rope to the surface. The cave was resealed, location marked. No press release, no report filed publicly. Back at Furnace Creek HQ, the samples were processed in-house, then forwarded to a forensic lab in Las Vegas. The boots yielded nothing, no prints, no sweat residue, no organic trace. The radio, too degraded. The wrappers, generic. But the blood? The blood said everything. Positive match. Colin Brooks. The call came in late. Rachel answered on the second ring. She didn't ask how much, she didn't ask how fresh, She just said, "So he made it that far." There were no human remains, no bones, no teeth, nothing to indicate what had happened after that last journal entry, but the DNA was proof of presence of life, and possibly injury. Some speculated he cut himself while building the spiral, others thought it was from a nosebleed, common in the desert's dry air. But a third theory lingered, quietly passed between the team. It wasn't accidental, it was ritual. Because everything in that chamber had been arranged. The tarp, the wrappers, the cup of stones, the spiral, the boots. There was intention in it, a sequence, a meaning they hadn't cracked. Garza stared at the lab printout for a long time. He wasn't a man given to emotion, but something in the stillness of that data made him uneasy, not because of what it confirmed, but because of how little it explained. Colin had lived long enough to build that room, to mark time on a wall, to leave messages. But at some point, he'd stopped leaving anything at all. No one knew if he'd walked away from that place, or if he'd stayed there until time ran out. The desert was silent on that. It always is. Theories filled the space that evidence couldn't. The Park Service said little, just that the cave had been located, samples collected, and the case remains under active investigation. But outside those closed walls, the questions multiplied. Did Colin fall? Was the blood on the tarp the result of injury during descent? If so, how did he move deeper into the cave system afterward? Why arrange the space so meticulously? Why leave the boots in the spiral? Why build the spiral at all? Some experts suggested psychological unraveling, isolation, starvation, heat stroke, all capable of distorting perception. They pointed to similar patterns among lost hikers: repetitive motion, object alignment, symbolic behaviors under stress. But Colin had training, structure. He hadn't panicked. He documented, planned, recorded. Others took it further. The spiral was a message, they argued, a code, a marker, not for himself but for whoever followed. And then there was the journal, the final entry that read like both confession and invitation. "If anyone finds this, I need you to finish what I started." But finish what? He hadn't been searching for survival. He was tracing something not on park maps or mining charts. The photos, the coordinates, the precise markings. Colin hadn't stumbled into that cave. He went there on purpose. Rachel believed it was a choice. He wasn't lost, she said in one interview. He was following something. A few voices online took it darker. They referenced the final scratched message near the tally marks. "Still here." Was that written for himself, or left behind as a warning? And what about the rest of the cave system? The radio team had mapped only the first 2 chambers, but a narrow corridor veered east, too tight for safe entry at the time. Equipment failure, crumbling stone, unstable ceilings. The mission had ended before they could go deeper. Some say that's where the real answer lies. Deeper, always deeper. But for now, there's only the room, the spiral, the boots, the silence. And the one man who walked into the desert not just to escape but to understand something the rest of us still can't name. Maybe the real mystery isn't what happened to Colin Brooks. Maybe it's why he believed there was something worth finding at all. Rachel Brooks hadn't set foot in Death Valley since the search was called off. 7 years of waiting, of not knowing, had changed her. Less grief now, more resolve. After the journal was recovered, after the photos and coordinates and DNA confirmation, she didn't hesitate. She chartered a film crew. Not for drama, not for profit, but to document the walk her brother had taken, step by step, as close to exact as possible. The project was quiet, crowdfunded under the name Still Here. A small team, 2 cameramen, 1 producer, a local guide. Rachel packed her brother's map, the one with the red circle. She brought a replica of the journal. She brought his voice with her. They started near Warm Spring Road, right where his truck had been found. The heat was already breaking 110 degrees by noon. The terrain hadn't changed. If anything, it had grown more hostile. Wind had reshaped the dunes. Rock falls had altered the canyon path. But she pressed on, same direction, same pace. Every night, she read a journal entry on camera, sat by the firelight, and let his words fill the space between ridgelines. Some pages cracked in her voice, others she read clean. Day 5 found a formation I don't recognize. Looks wrong, marking it anyway. On those days, she'd stop walking and stare at the horizon. The closer she got to the coordinates, the quieter she became. By the time they reached the ridge overlooking the cave site, she refused to speak on camera at all. Just stood there, hands on her hips, eyes scanning the landscape like she could will him into view. At the mouth of the shaft, she sat down and unpacked 2 items, a photograph of them as kids and a folded letter. She didn't read it aloud, just placed it at the edge, weighted it with a stone. Then she whispered, "Still here." Not for the cameras, not for the crew, just for him. When they hiked out 3 days later, no one talked for a long time. Not about answers, not about closure. Rachel didn't want either. She just wanted to be where he had been, even if it meant walking into the silence he left behind. Tecopa isn't a place people go to for long, just a gas station, a motel with a broken sign, and a bar that still serves Coors in bottles and cashes out on paper slips. But the town sits near the southern edge of the park, close enough that stories drift through, stick to the walls like desert dust. Rachel stopped there on the way out, sat at the bar, asked for coffee, and started asking questions. "Colin Brooks," she said, "July 2014. You remember anything?" The bartender didn't. Too many lost hikers, too many lost years. But someone at the corner table raised a hand. He was old, sun-creased, with a voice like gravel and a name nobody asked for. Called himself Wes. Said he'd been in the area during that exact summer, prospecting mostly. Scrapping metal, hauling back old tools from abandoned mines. Said something strange happened that July. "Up near Butte Valley," Wes said, "I saw lights, not like flashlights, higher, brighter, like flares. But they didn't arc, they just hovered." The table went quiet. He took a sip of beer, continued. "They'd pop in and out, always around the same ridge. Thought it was military at first, or rangers doing night drills. But I didn't hear choppers, didn't hear anything." Rachel leaned forward. "You tell anyone?" "Hell no," he said. "You try telling people you saw lights in Death Valley and didn't lose your damn mind out there, they start writing you off real quick." He paused, looked at her. "But now I know someone was out there. Maybe it was him." Other locals chimed in. A woman said she remembered hearing about a guy who looked like he was heading the wrong way, near an old mine entrance. Another recalled dogs barking at nothing for 3 nights straight that July. All of it anecdotal, nothing provable. But enough to suggest Colin hadn't been alone. Not entirely. Rachel took it in, didn't say much, just wrote it down, nodded. She wasn't trying to solve anything. She knew better than to think the desert would hand her clean answers. But what she did understand more clearly now than ever was that Colin had seen something out there. And maybe, just maybe, it had seen him too. The leak came fast. Somewhere between the field team's return and the lab results hitting internal files, word got out. Not the full story, just enough to stir interest. A mention on a conspiracy podcast. A blurry screenshot of Colin's journal entry posted on an obscure Reddit forum. A thread titled, "He Knew Something." It caught fire in the places that thrive on half-truths and heatstroke visions. And that was all it took. Within 48 hours, journalists were calling Furnace Creek HQ, asking about caves, about spirals, about blood. One reporter asked point blank if the Park Service had confirmed remains. Another cited anonymous sources, claiming the cave was older than any existing map. The Rangers shut it down. All public comment was suspended. Scheduled tours near Butte Valley were quietly canceled. Road access past the Emigrant Junction trailhead was blocked, due to erosion risk. Internal memos labeled the cave site as Protected Research Zone 8B. No mention of Colin. No reference to the ammo can, the journal, the spiral. Even Rachel was cut off. Calls stopped going through. Her email inquiries bounced back with automated replies. "Thank you for your interest in Death Valley National Park." That was it. The crew she'd worked with was told to cease filming, permits revoked, drones grounded. A letter arrived at her apartment postmarked from the Department of the Interior. It said nothing. Just a page with the words, "Ongoing investigation, no comment at this time." Inside the park, something shifted. Rangers who had spoken freely before now avoided eye contact. Off-duty staff grew tight-lipped. One ranger, when asked if the cave was still accessible, gave a quiet, apologetic shake of his head. The message was clear. This wasn't just about a missing person anymore. And whatever Colin had found out there, whatever he'd seen or entered or become a part of it, wasn't going to stay part of the public record. The desert keeps its secrets. And now, so did the park. Not because they wanted to, but because something told them they had to. It wasn't the rangers who found it. It was two hikers, Janelle and Theo, part-time geology students on spring break, mapping erosion patterns near the southern fork of Anvil Canyon. They didn't know the full story, just enough to make them curious. They'd heard whispers about a restricted cave, and like any students with more questions than sense, they decided to see what was out there. The entrance was sealed metal barrier, caution tape, a motion sensor mounted above, but the perimeter hadn't been cleaned. Wind still swept through, and with it, sand, loose gravel, bits of the past. That's when Theo spotted something half buried beneath a tumble of rock just beyond the barrier line. At first, he thought it was trash, just a piece of metal, jagged and scuffed. But when he brushed away the dirt, he saw the curve, the edge of something stamped. A fragment of military dog tag. The letters were partial, but readable. KSCUSMC. They stared at it, didn't touch it further, took photos. GPS pinned the location, reported it to the local ranger station the next day. Within hours, the site was swarmed. The tag was retrieved, sealed, cataloged, confirmed. It was Colin Brooks's. The rangers didn't deny this one. They couldn't. The photos were already online, too many people had seen. But their statement was measured, clinical. A previously undocumented personal item linked to Colin Brooks has been recovered near a restricted site. The area remains closed to ensure the integrity of ongoing research and public safety. But Rachel didn't care about their wording, because that tag changed everything. It was confirmation that Colin had made it out at least briefly, that he'd left the cave at some point, that his story didn't end underground, but continued, if only for another mile, another hour, another impossible choice. Theories exploded again. Was he injured? Was he trying to mark a trail? Why bury the tag? The desert doesn't answer questions. It offers pieces, just enough to pull you further in. And now, another piece of Colin had surfaced. Not a ghost, not a theory. Just a scrap of metal, half swallowed by the land. Still trying to be found. It came in an unmarked envelope. No return address, no message. Just a plain USB drive inside a manila sleeve, postmarked out of Barstow. Rachel found it in her mailbox the day after the dog tag photos went public. She didn't hesitate. Plugged it in. Clicked play. At first static. Harsh, unfiltered, like wind through a broken antenna. Then a burst of silence. Then a voice. His voice. Faint, but unmistakable. Colin. Okay, if this works. This is Colin Brooks. July 12. I'm at the site. But they're not who I thought. It's not just me out here. A pause. Shuffling. Breathing. Then. I hear them at night, past the canyon. No footsteps. Just presence. I thought it was dehydration. I don't think that anymore. More static. Then a final fragment. If I don't make it, someone needs to know this place was never empty. Click. End of file. Rachel sat frozen, hands still on the mouse, heart hammering. She played it again, and again. Each time the message scraped a little deeper. It wasn't the words that terrified her, it was the tone. He didn't sound panicked, he didn't sound lost. He sounded convinced, like a man who'd peeled back a layer of the world he wasn't meant to see. She sent the file to the park. They acknowledged receipt, nothing more. Under review. But Rachel knew it would never make it into a report. This wasn't evidence. It was a warning. And Colin hadn't whispered it into a void. He'd recorded it because he knew someone might listen. Someone like her. Someone willing to keep going, even when the map ended. Rachel had read the journal dozens of times, front to back, memorized every line, every margin note. But after the audio arrived, she went back again, this time looking for what wasn't obvious. That's when she saw them. Tiny pencil ticks in the lower corners of several pages, barely visible, not words, not symbols, coordinates, offset by just a few degrees from the known path. She overlaid them onto a digital terrain map. They formed a crooked loop linking obscure geological anomalies, dry lakes with no known source, canyons that dead-ended on official records, and one ridge marked only with a faded surveyor's note. Unstable ground, avoid. Colin had drawn 2 maps, one visible, one coded beneath. He hadn't just wandered, he'd followed something. Maybe the spiral wasn't the destination. Maybe it was the start. She printed both versions and layered them with transparent film. The lines matched too cleanly to be coincidence. The original path had gaps. This one didn't. It wove through the landscape like thread pulled through fabric, quiet, precise, deliberate. Places erased from current park maps showed up on geological archives from the 1950s, military annotations, mining activity that had supposedly ceased decades ago. Rachel made a list. 7 locations, none with trails, all within walking distance of the spiral. She understood now. Colin hadn't gotten lost. He'd gotten close. And he hadn't just left a message for anyone. He'd left it for someone who knew how to listen. Rachel picked up her pack, taped the decoded map to the inside flap, and whispered just once, "I'm still coming." Rachel had stayed quiet for years. Even after the journal surfaced, even after the cave, the tag, the voice on that recording, she followed the rules, respected the process, trusted that someone, somewhere, would care as much about the truth as she did. But when the audio file was ignored, brushed off without explanation, she knew the silence wasn't protection. It was strategy. She went public. A local paper picked it up first, then a podcast. Then a regional news outlet ran a piece titled, "Sister of Missing Veteran Demands Answers from Park Officials." The interview aired in 3 segments. Rachel spoke plainly, calmly, like someone who'd run out of time to be polite. She listed the facts, the journal, the photos, the cave, the tag, the audio, the sealed entrance, the disappearing permits, the blocked trails. "What are they protecting?" the reporter asked. Rachel didn't hesitate. "Something they don't want us to see." The National Park Service released a 2-paragraph statement, no mention of Colin, no acknowledgement of new findings. Just, "We are committed to visitor safety and the preservation of sensitive ecological zones." But then came the leak. An anonymous tip sent Rachel a zip file of internal communications emails between park supervisors dated just days after the ammo can was found. Subject lines read, "Secure perimeter," and "Do not share coordinates externally." In one, a senior ranger wrote, "If this reaches the public, it'll undermine everything we've tried to contain since '91. What had they tried to contain? Rachel posted the files. All of them. No commentary, just timestamps and text. Within hours, the threads lit up again. Theories multiplied, questions deepened. But Rachel wasn't chasing speculation. She was chasing her brother. And now, finally, she had one last trail to follow. The journal's final markings led them east away from the known cave, beyond the jagged ridges that even seasoned hikers avoided. Rachel's new map, the one layered with old survey routes, outlined a path that didn't exist anymore. Rock slides had covered parts of it. Flash floods had erased others. But the terrain remembered. With her were two of the original documentary crew and a veteran ranger who'd quit the service the year after Colin vanished. He'd seen the hatch once, he said, years ago. Thought it was a water cistern or leftover mining infrastructure, but it had no ladder, no seams, just a steel circle embedded in stone. They found it on the fourth day. Carved into the rock face, barely visible until you stood over it. A perfect disc, flush with the ground, streaked with age, no handle, no hinges, just welded steel and silence. But around the edge, someone had etched a single line, deliberate, shallow, done by hand. Last light falls here. Rachel crouched, brushed away the dust, ran her fingers along the groove. It matched the handwriting in the journal. Collins. They scanned it, photographed it, knocked once. The sound echoed dull and deep. No give, no reply. But on the ridge above, a rock had been propped upright, placed, not fallen. Beneath it, a small sealed bag with another note inside. Not everything buried is lost. Some things are waiting. The team didn't speak, not at first. They just stood there, wind tugging at their sleeves, sun falling across the hatch like a clock running out. Rachel closed her eyes. She didn't need a key, not yet. Because finding it meant one thing. Colin had walked this far, and he'd left the hatch behind, not as an end, but as an invitation. It took 3 hours and a portable hydraulic jack to crack the seal. The hatch didn't open so much as groan, a sound like old bones shifting after years of silence. When the steel disc finally gave, a draft of cool, stale air rose up, the kind that hadn't moved in decades. Beneath, a rusted ladder bolted into concrete. They descended slowly. The space was deeper than they expected, maybe 30 feet down, a reinforced chamber carved directly into the bedrock. The walls were lined with aging supplies. Crates of MREs stamped 1,987, stacks of sealed water cans, old medical kits, and a shelf sagging under the weight of outdated communication gear. At the center of the room sat a folding cot. A faded tarp had been strung above it like a ceiling. Near the far wall, under a dusty lantern, was a small wooden crate, inside a spiral of stones. A mirror of the one from the cave. And then they found it. Taped to the wall behind the crate, yellowed paper, fragile at the corners. A handwritten note. "I made it this far. I wasn't supposed to." The penmanship was unmistakable. Colin. There was no date, no further explanation. Just that single, jarring admission. They searched the bunker for hours, cataloged everything. No sign of recent life, no footprints beyond their own, no body. But his presence was everywhere in the way supplies had been sorted, in the tarp tied the same way as in the spiral room, in the symmetry of how the space had been used. Colin hadn't died on the trail. He'd made it underground, and he'd lived how long no one could say. But his final message was clear: he was never meant to arrive. The hatch hadn't been a goal. It had been a gate. And whatever Colin had crossed into, he had crossed alone. Rachel left a marker near the hatch. A simple stone pillar, engraved with her brother's name and the date they found the bunker. She didn't write a message. She didn't have to. The desert already knew. The documentary aired 6 months later. It was quiet, measured, no dramatics, no conspiracies. Just footage of the journey, Colin's words, the places he touched, the choices he made. Critics called it haunting. Viewers called it brave. The Park Service didn't comment. But people noticed when a section of Death Valley was quietly designated as a protected historical zone. No press release, just redrawn boundaries and new trail signs rerouted away from the ridge. Rangers were seen patrolling the area more frequently. Unmarked vehicles parked overnight near the trailhead. Cameras installed facing nowhere in particular. The hatch was never mentioned. Rachel never returned. She said what she needed to say, left what she needed to leave. Not closure. Colin's story had never asked for that. Just acknowledgement. That he was here, that he had walked farther than most ever dared, that he saw something beneath the sand and sun and silence and chose to follow it, no matter where it led. Some say he was searching for peace. Some say he found a truth too big to bring back. Others just whisper his name when the wind cuts strange through the canyons. Because, in Death Valley, not every mystery ends. But some change everything. This story was brutal, But this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.